Great, thanks. I think it's been a really useful and productive day for us to look at technology enhanced data collection in education settings. And it does feel a little bit like pioneering work, I think, for those of us who've kind of come up in education or psychology, but particularly doing research in education. I think it's been really useful, and it feels really like kind of a frontier research, and so I think it's been really interesting. But what I want to talk about is sort of the key issues in the use of digital technology, so I'll just do a really quick overview of key themes, looking at some practical issues and some ethical issues. And those are things that have kind of been hinted at in today's talk, but not very explicitly noted, so I want to just kind of address some of those issues that kind of cut across all of the presentations today. So the key themes, and I won't spend time going through these, but we've had great work from Thomas Getz, and then looking at Neil Latham's work with smartphones, eye tracking with Andreas, connecting mental states and bodily events, and capturing affect through mobile technology in the Eden project, which was interesting. And then finally, looking at joystick methods, which in presentations 4 and 6 obviously had a lot in common, I think, with slightly different methodologies, but some key themes that were shared. But there's been a real progression of data collection in education. And this seminar is about looking at intrapersonal research in educational settings. And so we know that even 10 years ago, that most of the data was collected in the field, and most of the data entry forms, which were paper and pencil, were entered into a computer. And we're talking about today where we're collecting data with tablet or a phone or various kinds of technology, and then aggregating those data automatically using various forms of data collection and then integration and aggregation. We don't really know what we're going to be doing in 2025. And again, this feels like pioneering research because some of it, I'm not saying it's crude research, but this is new that we're collecting data this way in education settings anyways. I know that Neil talked about the Smartphone Psychology Manifesto. And it's actually quite interesting to read, but one of the comments was in 2025, using paper and pencil questionnaires with a few hundred local college students would border on scientific malpractice. And for those of us who have submitted those kinds of manuscripts or have done that kind of editorial work, we know that that's not really okay. I don't think, I'm just thinking in the last week or so, I was working for a journal and rejected a manuscript kind of for this reason particularly, that when we do cross-sectional data using paper and pencil methods in one particular setting, it's not really acceptable anymore in most situations. In Miller's Smartphone Psychology Manifesto, he talked about this idea of psychology being driven by methodologies, and he mentioned that new research technology sparks not just new findings, but new research areas and theories. And so he talked about this idea that, that the way that research progresses in psychology and in education is really driven to some extent by the methodologies. And so he goes through the history and talks about what was termed brass instrument psychology, led to perception and memory research in the late 1800s. Computers led to cognitive psychology in the 60s and 70s. Brain imaging led to cognitive, affective, and social neuroscience in the 1990s and onwards. So the way that we conduct our research and collect our data actually really makes a difference to the field, not just in getting more data, but it actually drives new theories and new advances in the field. So let's look at practical issues. And the number one that I want to mention is that technology may interfere with normal social interactions. We know that. So eye tracking. Andreas, you do some eye tracking. I've done a little bit of eye tracking myself. And we know that, they'll hardly notice that I'm wearing my new mobile eye tracker. It's not quite that bad right now. In fact, the equipment is getting much better. But we do have some anecdotal evidence about how people react to eye trackers, but not much research that actually studies the changes in people's perceptions. So we know a very little bit about observer effects, but we don't know very much about how social interactions are influenced by novel equipment. This is a bit outlandish, obviously, but the equipment that we see these days isn't that, I think this is the tablets, is that right? Is this and it's great equipment, but it does have an effect not just on the participants in a study, who might be students, for example, but also on the wearer, the way that they react to things. These are some of the systems. We used these Tobii glasses for a while. Now we're using some SMI glasses. They look very much like that, but they do have an effect both for the wearer and for the observer. And again, most of that information is anecdotal, and most people who sell the equipment, use the equipment, say, oh, you get used to it after the first 10 minutes, nobody knows that it's there. That may be true, but it might not be true as well. And we don't know very much about that. The practical issue number 2, and this is with video observation and cameras, we know that technology and repeated measurements may exacerbate observer effects. So Stigler wrote a seminal paper in 1999 on observer effects and what happens in the classroom. And he talked about reactivity in terms of how people react to being observed. And observer effects are a threat to validity in technology-aided data collection. So we don't know how people actually react and behave, if they're behaving normally when we're filming them. And we don't know very much about whether people are acting in a typical fashion. Again, most of our evidence is anecdotal. We assume that people habituate to a camera in the classroom. But we also don't really know if teaching is different. And so there's been some research. Stigler said, for example, that observed lessons may be a somewhat idealized version of what the teacher normally does in the classroom. And he tried to argue that reactivity effects are not a serious problem. Of course, he was somebody who did a lot of research in this area using TIMS data, and so the video data that was produced through TIMS. But the problem isn't unique to video studies. Questionnaires have the same potential to influence behavior. Teachers' questionnaire responses, if you're measuring those, also may have biased responses and culturally or socially appropriate or desired responses. So we're not really sure if people who are wearing equipment or being filmed are, for example, teaching in the same way or learning in the same way used in technology-enhanced data collection. We know, for example, there is some research that shows that monitoring can have paradoxical effects on performance. So Becker and Marie, just recently, monitored performance and found that monitored performance can be lower than unmonitored performance for simple tasks, because the act of monitoring can actually make people more careful when they're doing sorting tasks, for example. So monitoring doesn't necessarily improve behavior or improve productivity or performance. It can actually slow down performance depending on the complexity of the task and the nature of the task. But in their study, they had participants do a peg sorting task, and they found that camera observations, just the presence of a camera, actually slowed down performance when people thought that they were being observed. The practical issue number 3, and this is especially with intensive longitudinal data, we don't really know if frequent reporting may influence activation of emotions and motivation. So here's our, this is a meme. I kind of know this, but not really. Ella would know this. But so tell me, what are your problems? It's a cat, cat photos and all that. But the idea when you're asked about your problems, it actually influences the relationship between what you think about in a particular time, and it actually changes the way that you perceive your problems and your emotions, for example. So we know that frequent reporting of emotions might trigger emotions. There's an effect on emotion activation when we ask people to report sadness or happiness, and that's been found in several studies, although there's different kind of evidence that suggests different sides of that argument. But the question is, does the act of reporting disrupt normal emotional response? And is that effect actually exacerbated in intensive longitudinal data collection? So when you ask somebody 10 times or 20 times, what does that do to sadness or to, and of course, I know that Thomas and Anu talked about the idea of the methodology can be an intervention, whether desired or not. Hutcherson and all used functional neuroimaging to actually look at how reporting on emotions affected different areas of the brain. They used emotion-eliciting funny and sad films and employed a novel method of continuous self-reported rating of emotion experience and compared the impact of rating with passive viewing of these funny and sad films. And what they found, in fact, is that the act of reporting didn't activate different neural systems that actually did activate. They found that the comparison of rating versus passive viewing of funny and sad movies didn't actually change the brain areas that were activated, that were emotion activated. So they found that subjective rating of ongoing emotional responses did not decrease either self-reported experience of emotion or neural activation related to the passive viewing in any brain region. So the results suggest that ratings one feelings activates different areas of the brain than experiencing those same feelings. And so their argument, with of course a small sample size, was that in fact that rating doesn't activate the same areas of the brain that are activated by actually experiencing those emotions. But other researchers have found fairly strong measurement effects. So how do you feel right now this minute? When you're asked that question over and over again, it may be that, in fact, there is a measurement effect. Klassen and Mendez experienced physiological changes related from emotion ratings and induced emotions. And in their study, they found that measurement effects exist throughout this, their research, and they found that they had a task, a difficult math task that was meant to, in fact, activate anger and shame, and they measured that in various ways. And they found that results showed that asking people about their emotions had a significant impact on their physiological responses, and that the impact may depend on the type of emotion experienced. So they found none of the activation for shame, but they did find, in fact, that there was a measurement effect for anger. They explained that by looking at rumination, that self-reports of emotional experience require introspection and an awareness that may change actual emotional processes. Let's talk briefly about some ethical issues that also might be relevant to technology-enhanced data collection in education settings. And the ethical issue number one that is something that we are aware of and maybe deal with a little bit, but it's this idea that some forms, we'll do one more practical issue. We know that we overinterpret behaviors and perceptual processes as cognition. This is especially true with eye tracking, but with other things as well. So in eye tracking, we can easily measure durations of fixation and targeted gaze, but we don't really know what that means. So I know that Andreas mentioned this, of course, but we don't know what it means when people are looking at something in particular. We don't know what reciprocated gaze means, and that's an important interaction in eye tracking. We don't know if it means I love you, or I hate you, or I'm not even thinking about you, I just happen to be staring into space. Division of gaze targets. So when we have gaze that's dispersed across a group, we don't know what that means when we are looking at something, or when we never look at this particular area of a room. Duration and frequency of group scans. We don't know what ignoring a group means. And so there's a tendency, especially if you come from studying motivation and emotions, for example, to see eye tracking as something that will give you insight into motivation and emotions and engagement, for example, but it's not necessarily clear that that's the case. We don't know if a change in gaze patterns over time, what that means as well. So we do know that there are some behavioral changes, but we don't know if that corresponds with, for example, emotional change or motivation changes. So we can't easily measure the pragmatics or the intention of gaze. We don't know what it means. Why are you looking at me? Why aren't you looking at me? And in the research that we were doing on teacher gaze, we don't really know that gaze is the same as engagement or motivation. And of course there are ways to help out. So when you're looking retrospectively at gaze data, you can talk with the teachers and get a sense of what, in fact, their behaviors, how they interpret their behaviors. So the ethical issue number one is that some forms of technology-inspired data collection are inherently non-anonymous, even with masking, and we try to mask sometimes when, our video data so that if it's used, we mask the identity of people, but it doesn't always work that well. So most of you probably know who this is. We did some work looking at teacher-student gaze and so on, and did various forms of masking with graying out and so forth, and using low-quality video images. But it's not necessarily the case that identity is protected. Even when we get permission, we're not really sure how the video data are going to be used in the future as well. And it's an ethical issue that is a tricky ethical issue. I know that we talked about that a little bit before. So this idea that the contexts of use for digital records are increasingly distant from the research project that produces them makes their use less predictable. So several of us used video data today, and I've used some here, that probably we didn't ask, can we present these video data to a group in Oxford in June 2015? And it's not really the same issue that you have with paper and pencil data collection. So it's an ethical issue that needs to be considered. And there's this idea that the further away you get from your research group to graduate teaching, conference presentations, and onto the web is always a possibility with video data and with other kinds of technology-enhanced data in education. Overall, I just want to say that I thought the presentation and the mix of presentations were really useful today, and that an increasing use of technology brings the possibility of really new understandings that can drive whatever your field is, but in our field, in education research or in educational psychology research, these approaches that we talked about today, I think really are pioneering and are very, very interesting and can really change the way that we understand behavior and how people function. And so I just wanted to thank very much the people who presented today, and just really thought it was very strong and a great group, so thanks very much.